Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, co-owner of the company Horns of Odin, and I'm joined as always by Dr. Mathias Nordvig.
Hello, everybody. This time we are going to be talking with just me and Daniel. We are having a nice little conversation about, Daniel is going to tell us about his trip to Oslo, and we're also going to talk about goddesses in the Old Norse Pantheon. So, welcome to the show, everybody.
I feel like how have we gone 116 episodes and not done one on goddesses yet?
I mean, I guess that speaks a little too much to the dudism of it all, I guess. Maybe we're a little too much bros that we haven't talked about goddesses before.
Probably. I mean, episode 1 is Shield Maidens. And
that is true. That is true.
So,
as Shan is pointing out in the chat, there is no good way to answer this question.
No, I didn't mean it like that. We've touched on it. We've touched on it for sure.
Yes. But to be fair, the main explanation is just because we're a bunch of ding dongs, and that's it. So
quick, fucking get rid of the shovels before we dig ourselves any deeper. Oh dear, how are you doing? Before I tell you about my trip, how's life for Mathias?
Oh well, it's quote unquote complicated. It's
I
going
feel you
better.
on that one.
Yeah, I know. No, it's going better over here. We've dealt with a bunch of health issues in the family, and everything is starting to get back on track and everything. So just slowly getting better. Spring is starting to come up here in the mountains at 9,200 feet. I mean, we still don't have any buds or leaves or anything on the trees, but I can see that spring is just about to get there. It'll probably happen sometime mid-June, and until then, we're going to still have a couple of snowfalls. But that, if nothing else, makes me feel better. So
and then you'll be right back into winter again.
Absolutely, yeah. It'll happen in August.
the first winter.
The first winter. Fool's winter.
Oh dear. So I was in Oslo this last weekend. Had a really, really good time. Enjoyed it. Beautiful country. Met some good people. Got to go to the museum in the center, in the really beautiful
museum in the center. You don't even know what museum you went to.
Matthias, you're asking me this question. What do you think? What do you think? Because I don't know the name of
it. Are you talking about the National Museum or what are you talking about?
It froze. Are you back?
I am back. I'm asking you if it was the National Museum or National Museet.
I think so. Yes, I think so. I'm not 100% sure. It was pretty. They had some nice things in there. They have they had like a Viking exhibition on the top floor. At the minute, and it was good. I got to wander around with my little backpack on, taking pictures of all the pretty things.
That sounds great.
Like a little tourist. Yeah, Monica says it's the National Museum. So yeah, apparently it was the National Museum.
Yeah.
So that was good. And then obviously I went to meet Runa from Midgardsblot for a little sneaky secret meeting. So first, hopefully something we're going to be able to announce shortly that involves us as well.
Yes.
Which
that does sound very exciting.
It is exciting. So definitely stay tuned for that, because we're going to have some big announcements, I think.
I think we will. Yes. We would just be dropping bombs on people.
Rather than knowledge bombs, actual interesting fun bombs. Things we're going to do. So that was fun. yeah, to be honest, I just had a good time. It was nice to get away and see the pretty place.
see a foreign country.
That's it. Yeah. Well, it's fun because I got to go. Like I went on my own, so that was nice. I just have that alone time to go and wander and be a free spirit, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Sounds wonderful.
Perfect. I think that's. Oh, one thing I want to say is I forgot this. And I put this on my Instagram earlier. Was that you remember when we did the coconut episode? You probably remember this. I forgot this. When not the coconut episode, when they did the episode where I was drinking our coconut for no apparent reason. I just saw it in the stock shop, and then decided to say in the episode that when we get to 200 patrons, I will do the episode in a coconut bikini. Yes. Well, apparently we are now at like 185 patrons, and I'm getting a little bit scared.
The people have heard you.
I apparently so. I put it on my Instagram today, and then we had like a bunch of new subscribers. I'm like, fuck.
I think that's great. I mean, I this of course deserves to be mentioned over and over again. That once we get to 200 Patreon supporters, Daniel will be doing the episode in a coconut bikini. I just want to reiterate that he will be doing the episode in a coconut bikini, and everybody who is a Patreon supporter will get access to the visuals of that coconut bikini. So
and a grass skirt. I'm definitely getting a grass skirt. If I'm doing it, of course I'm going all in. Of course I am.
And a hat, like a fruit hat of some kind, right? You know,
banana hat.
Yeah, or pineapple or something.
Chiquita bonita lady. Is that right?
Something like that.
I'm sure that's what they were called over here. That was just completely racist, and Shan's gonna have to edit out the episode.
Oh shit!
See,
what do you do now, man?
No, that's what they were called. They used to have the advert on. I remember it when I was a kid. So yeah, so when we hit 200, I'm gonna wear a coconut bikini. So if you do like the show and you do want to see that happen, just pop over to Patreon. I know a few people think it's really complicated. It takes a few seconds. It's Nordic Mythology Podcast. No, Patreon/Nordic Mythology Podcast. It's the price of buying one of us a cup of coffee. And
I mean, I might actually become a Patreon supporter of our podcast.
Just to see it happen. I know. Luciano messaged me. He's like, let me know when you get to 199. No, I'm not telling you that. Should we get into goddesses?
Yes, let's do the whole thing about goddesses, because that is a very, very interesting topic. As we've neglected like to say.
We've neglected for 115 episodes.
Yes, as we have been neglecting it for a pretty long time at this point. Yes. Okay. So what is the first thing you'd like to know about goddesses, Dan?
What constitutes as a goddess?
That's a really good question. Okay, so actually that's a really good place to start, because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but in the Germanic languages, and English is actually a Germanic language, even though some people are like, oh, is it? Yeah, it is. Just the whole basis for English is Germanic. And you got a bunch of like French influence and Latin and so on, but it's still a Germanic language. And the interesting thing is that in English and all the other Germanic languages, the word God used to be a neutral word.
Okay.
It was not a gendered male originally, and this also means then that we didn't have, you know, a female version of a god either. So if you dig into the etymology of the word itself, then it looks like it meant something like a something that is addressed, something that you call upon, or yeah, you know, communicate with in some kind of religious context. So that means that anything could be a god, essentially, if it's just religiously charged, right? And it also means that it doesn't matter. Like you, for instance.
We are starting a bit of a cult over in the Discord, so
yes,
maybe I'm going to ascend.
You have to have gold gold-plated balls to be a god, just so you know.
You've not seen my balls.
No, but I know that there are several Mexican gang members over the years who have died trying to gold plate their balls. So
Really?
yes, it's a thing. I don't know why it's a thing, but it's a thing, man.
I mean, why is it not a thing? Of course it's a thing.
How can you gold plate balls? It doesn't work, man.
Hey.
Right, great. By the way, we're talking about goddesses, and we've already, diverted ourselves to balls. So, okay, going back to the subject at hand, the word itself did not distinguish between male or female in that regard. So that means that the word could, for instance, the Old Norse god, could be used about all of them. Now, so that's really important to consider, because it also means that we can't necessarily expect the same sort of like gender connotations that we today would associate with mythologies and religions and so on to have been present back then. Of course, there were very similar gender connotations, though, in some cases at least. But it's just important to consider that we can't expect it. Right? We can expect that people perhaps had multiple ways of thinking about these things in different ways. Okay.
So how do we know who's male and who's female then, if the same word applies to both?
Well, I mean, so fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you approach the topic, the mythology that we have written down is written down in that firmly Christianized context where God is a male. And so we see Snorri Sturluson, for instance, distinguishing between Icer as the male gods and Ausinir as the female deities. Right?
Okay.
Now, it's not clear that actually was a distinction that existed prior to medieval Iceland. It could have been, it actually kind of looks like Snorri Sturluson might have invented that fucking distinction. So that's also important to consider, that if you asked a Viking about the Icer, that Viking might not have distinguished between a male and a female Aus if you ask that question. Who are they? What are they? And so on. We don't know if a Viking would have thought, oh well, the Icer are male, and then there are the Ausinir. That could just as well just be Snorri Sturluson who's inventing that little bit. So that's really important to consider. All right. So what are the earliest evidence of goddesses in this whole mythology? Well, the earliest archaeological material that we have is on the Matronae from the Rhineland, and like that whole area that goes from, which is the parts that are now eastern France and western Germany, all the way up along the Rhine through the Netherlands, and that whole area. That's where you see a lot of goddess worship in the first couple of centuries CE. And what we can see is that this is a mix of Celtic, Roman, and Germanic goddess cults that are being generated there. And we can see a slow and steady trickle of related cultic activity, if we could call it that, into Scandinavia from that area. And we have the Roman historian Tacitus, who writes about goddess worship in a quote unquote an island up in the Northern Ocean, and that is probably somewhere in Denmark. He talks about a goddess named Nerthus, who's being transported around in a wagon during certain times of the year, and kept in a temple by a lake at other times of the year. And what we have from that same time period when Tacitus is writing, we have a bunch of wagons that have been deposited in bogs and lakes in the Danish area. So far, 6 of them have been found. So it actually kind of seems like he's talking about some kind of cult that is actually leaving archaeological remains in that time period when he's talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have a bunch of depictions of females in various forms on archaeological material from that time period and onwards. So we know that they're worshiping goddesses in Scandinavia in that time.
Does it seem like it's more like individual cults rather than a wide range of worshipping goddesses? Does it seem like, I guess, like for the most part, people would worship the gods, like the male figures, and then like you'd have sects or little like cults that would go towards the females, or is that not an issue or a thing?
I don't think so. I think it looks like there is a relatively even distribution of people's religious interests in various deities.
Okay.
Like,
do you see male cults in the same way that you mentioned with the female one? Do you see that as well, like kind of little sects where they choose one god or one deity to
the thing is that we don't have when it comes to like Scandinavia in the centuries after Tacitus, we don't have, and this goes for all religion essentially, all religious practices. We don't have a very good picture of like distinct cults for anything, really.
Okay.
Like what we have is like scattered evidence that looks like a smoking gun, so to speak, or maybe the smoke from the fire, or however you want to say. So for instance, we have like temples that we have like archaeologically uncovered in many places in Scandinavia. Now, archaeologists don't like to call it temples because of some random ass debates that happened in the early 20th century, but they are temples. That's just what they are. And archaeologists would like for me to call them cult houses instead, just so you know. But they're fucking temples, okay?
What's the difference?
The difference is like nitpicking terminology, because if you say temple and people are thinking like, maybe something like Roman with like stone columns and all that stuff, and that's not exactly what we have. But then on the other hand, because like one of the things that archaeologists will be pointing out is that, well, these locations where we can see distinct religious and cultic activity, they are also used for other things. And it's like, yeah, sure. And then the archaeologists like, so let's call them cult houses instead of temples. But on the other hand, the temples in Rome and Greece and elsewhere, they were also used for other things than distinct religious activities. So is it really that big of a difference? Anyway, it doesn't really matter.
No,
I call them temples.
A temple is just, it's different depending on where you are in the world, what religion. They're all completely different. I mean, yeah. I'm sure there's some temples over here in England where people go and play football in the afternoon.
Like, I am sure.
They're multi-purpose. Like they get used for a bunch of different things.
Yes. Oh, I'm sure you're right about that. So
I know I'm right about it. I've played football in them.
Okay. Well, there you are. All right. So these temple sites, for instance, they show evidence of various, what we would call in the lingo of the field, cultic activity. And a lot of it seems sort of like cast, at least when we get to the 500s and onwards, a lot of it seems cast in sort of a, if you could call it quote unquote male image, in the sense that a lot of the items that are found, they carry images of men on them, or things that have to do with war or warriorhood or the status of a man of some kind. So there seems to be a shift too, where from the 500s and onwards, religious activity pivots more towards the activities of not just men, but more specifically the ruling warrior elites, right?
Okay.
So you have a development in society where everything becomes more and more structured around warrior elites. And this is what is essentially the Viking Age. The Viking Age is kind of defined by the fact that we have societies in Scandinavia that are dominated by a warrior elite, which might not have been the case before the 500s. What we might have seen before the 500s are more things like tribal councils, perhaps. This is me just like suggesting, because we have very, very little evidence for how these societies were actually structured back then. But we can see a shift towards a warrior elite that starts governing society after 500. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the alternative that was in place before that is not leaving the same kind of evidence in archaeology, right? And this is not to like make this like lame distinction that you get with Gimbutas, this 1950s archaeologist, like, oh, there used to be matriarchal societies and now there are patriarchal societies because la 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 la. No, that's not how it works. That's never how it worked. We didn't have like some weird golden age in far back in time where it was only matriarchal societies, and then it's pivoted towards a darker age with male societies and patriarchal societies. That's not how history has worked out either. At sometimes you can see perhaps societies that lean more matriarchal, and at other times lean more patriarchal, and sometimes they might go extreme too. That is a possibility. So what I'm just saying is that we get a more patriarchal society from the 500s onwards, but we don't know what was before the 500s.
Okay.
Except we can see evidence of a religious cult that is centered around lakes and bogs and rivers, groves, and a lot of the items that we see sacrificed in those lakes, bogs, rivers, and groves seem to be more goddess aligned in context of what we can read in the later literature, right?
Okay.
So for instance, we see these wagons being put in lakes and bogs in the Danish area in the first couple of centuries CE, and we have the historian Tacitus, who's writing about a goddess in a wagon and so on, and this is all attached to lakes as well.
I imagine a wagon's quite a expensive thing that you're not going to put in a lake without good reason for it. You know, it's yes. Usable. It means something. It might sound kind of trivial today, but back then a wagon was important.
Exactly. And you know, some of them are adorned with like metal brass coatings and those kinds of things, very intricately carved, all those kinds of things. So people put a lot of effort into creating them, right? And
is that kind of like the ones at the ship museum in Oslo?
Yeah.
Because those are when you say a wagon, like I think for anybody listening, when you say wagon, I think of like just planks of wood on the side there with the hay bales in and the two wheels and all. That's kind of like I imagine what people will think listening to this though.
That's definitely not what it is. You can go to the National Museum in Denmark and you can see some of these wagons that have been uncovered, and they're fucking beautiful, man. They have little heads carved on the sides and all kinds of things going on. So it's a lot more ornate and intricate than that sort of like a frumpy medieval wagon you're describing right there.
That's kind of the thought though. Even that frumpy medieval wagon is still valuable to his people, but like you said, the ones that I saw at the ship museum in Oslo are unbelievably well. They're unbelievable, intricate, detailed. Like it's unbelievable is the only word to think when you see that and kind of look at it and go, how the fuck did somebody make this? And hopefully we'll get Shan to put maybe like a link in the show notes so people can check it out, because it is remarkable. It's not just a wagon.
No, exactly, and that's the analogy I like to make when talking about these wagons and ships, for that matter, that later on I put in the the graves in the Viking Age, it's sort of like the same thing as if Jeff Bezos, like he got that huge yacht made in the Netherlands where they had to take down a fucking bridge to be able to sail it out of the harbor. And like it's kind of like the same with like if Jeff Bezos was like, you look guys, I'm gonna die soon, and when I die I want you to chuck me in my yacht and then put a Bentley in the yacht as well, and then a bunch of my gold and some animals and slaves or whatever the fuck he's got. That's what the Vikings did. They sacrificed slaves and put them in them as well.
That sounds like
and
some
then,
Elon Musk energy right there.
Well, I feel like it's any of those billionaires' energy.
Probably,
and then,
yeah.
Then they chuck that in a burial mound, right? That's what it's about, right? That's what that's sort of like the same analogy that is the analogy that we can use here. I think, like if Jeff Bezos wanted to go out that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're not. It's not just some kind of menial thing. Like it's so hard to even describe how intricately carved some of these things are. I still don't understand how they did it. It's beyond words. I remember the first time when I went to the ship museum and just walking around, I felt speechless, and it's overwhelming until you don't realize until you kind of see it in person, and then it's overwhelming. You're like, okay, how did they carve this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man, they were some really, really good craftsmen back then. Holy shit.
And
yeah,
women.
so moving
women.
Getting back to the goddesses, right? So what we can see in that time period up until the 500s is this cultic activity in Scandinavia centered around these bogs and lakes and groves, as I mentioned. There's a decent amount of human sacrifice involved as well. So there is something that suggests that these goddesses needed humans. This is why we have all of those very well preserved bog bodies in northern Germany and in the Netherlands and Denmark and so on.
Okay, here's a question. I've got to ask this as it comes into my mind. So, do we see a correlation between if it's like a sacrifice to a male god, would it be a female slave, and vice versa? If it was a female god, would it be a male slave? Is that, or is there any possibility to even know that?
There's nothing that we can sort of like use to really say for sure that is a way that they were thinking, except for one thing, and that is so this, going back to this Nerthus ritual. Nerthus is a goddess who is transported around by, according to Tacitus, a male slave. And we're told at the end of the story that this male slave, quote unquote, is consumed by the bog afterwards. So it sounds like he's being sacrificed.
He's thrown in the bog, man.
Yes, they bogged him.
Let's call a kettle. He's thrown in the bog. The poor guy.
Yeah. So it does look like that there is some kind of like male-female relationship here, of a female deity and then a male warden of some kind, who is then supposed to join her. I think that might be the logic behind it, that he is joining her in the bog. And this is where it gets really funky, because we do have another story that is a very similar story about a wagon ritual, but this story is written in Iceland in the early 1300s, and it describes a ritual where the god Freyr is transported around in a wagon in like the Swedish hillbilly country. That's always where the Icelanders put the paganism in their stories. Like, Swedish hillbillies are the ones who do pagan stuff. And so in this situation, this is really interesting because what we have is a story about Christianization. That's always what it is, right? So we have a guy who's Christian. He runs into these weird backwards Swedish hillbillies who are doing pagan rituals. And so now he has to do something about it, right? And in this context, our good friend Gunnar, he essentially, so Freyr is being taken care of by a female priestess servant kind of person, and in according to the story, she is quote unquote married to Freyr. Okay, so there's already the implication of a sexual relationship between this priestess and then a religious idol, right? Now, since this is a Christian story, this religious idol has been possessed by a demon, right? Who is an agent of the devil. This is what happens according to medieval Christianity. If you give sacrifices and offerings to a wooden idol or a stone idol that you created, then it will be possessed by a demon at some point. And then that demon will start fucking around with you.
How
right?
convenient.
How convenient.
If you do that, demons.
Yes, demons. And then that demon starts fucking around with you. And apparently in this context, quite literally, right? Because she has apparently some kind of sexual relationship with this Freyr demon. Okay, what happens next is that Gunnar then kicks Freyr's ass. He has a wrestling match or something with him, like they get into it, and then he kicks him out, and then he takes the place of the idol, and that's how he then impregnates this priestess. So what do we learn from this story? Okay, first of all, surface level, this is of course a story about a Christian story about how ridiculous paganism is. They believe in superstition and demons and so on. But the underlying layer here, if there's any truth to the story, which I think there is that it seems like there has been this fertility cult in Scandinavia that was centered around this usage of wagons to transport deities around in a certain landscape that they presumed owned, right? Like presumably they owned that landscape and were in charge of the fertility and everything. And if it was a male deity, then it would be a female priest or warden or guardian or whatever we want to call that, and it would be assumed that they were in a marriage or sexual relationship. So it does look like what we have in this story is essentially like the inverted version of that Nathus ritual. Like this is also pretty interesting that Nathus etymologically is the older form of the name Njörður. And Njörður is the father of Freyr and also a fertility god. So
would you look at that? Would you look at that?
So there seems to be something to this, right? And there does seem to be this sort of like male-female relationship that is playing out in the same way as it would in a regular partnership or marriage.
That's got my thinking now. Do we ever see like gods change sex? Like
it does look like it, right?
Through time period, like do they just go from?
I mean, it looks like Nerthus.
I was thinking other than that, do we know of any that maybe have started out female, became male, or vice versa?
There's not a lot that can be safely said about this, but there is something that I mean, if you look at the mythology, we do have some instances where it's very, very clear that there is something going on in terms of someone's sex being threatened, right? And the best example is the story about Skadi, right? Which we know is an old story, and we know it's a story that is tied to southern Scandinavia because we find parts of this story also in Saxo, the Danish historian who's writing just before Snorri is writing, right? And he knows the story too, but he knows it in a very different version, and it's it has something, it has some kind of relationship to these wagon gods, Njörður and Freyja and so on. Anyway, Skadi.
I'd be gutted if 1,000 years later I was known as a wagon god. I would be so upset if that's how I was remembered on a podcast in 2022, was the wagon god.
Okay, so what we have is, of course, a Nerthus figure in the 1st century CE, who is female, and then going 1100 years into the future, in the Icelandic literature that is being written about Nordic gods, this Nerthus figure has changed sex and is now Njörður, who's a male god and who's said to rule the temples.
Do you think that links to what you were saying about it becoming like a warrior culture, a more patriarchal society? Do you think that maybe that is part of why it kind of transitions?
That's a reasonable interpretation. It's possible, because what we do see is that this story about deities in wagons, all of a sudden we have the story about Freyr, who's a deity in a wagon, who's in charge of the fertility of the land and being carted around by some chick. And in the same way, we also have a couple of stories about especially Danish kings who, after they die, get embalmed, or in other ways, like we pretend they're still alive and we transport them around in the country, and in that way we maintain fertility of the land. That's like that's always the thing that comes together here: a god, a wagon, and fertility when they're like driving around in the country. So there is something to be said for, like, it looks like there is basically like a sex change for these wagon deities, and then they start being dudes with giant wings. Because that's what Freyja is, right?
I mean,
but okay, so here's the interesting thing. If we go to Snorri's story about Njörður and Skadi, it's just really fascinating to see that we have the situation where it starts with the story about how Odin, Loki, and Hænir run into Thjatsi, this eagle demon kind of thing, who threatens the life and fertility and immortality of the gods. How does he do this? Well, first of all, we have a situation where these Odin, Hænir, and Loki, they're like hanging out in the wilderness somewhere, and then they see a herd of oxen, and they're like, hey, let's eat one of those. And they're like, okay, cool. So let's build a little turf oven and roast that oxen in it. And then they're like, wait, this meat isn't getting done, even though we had it in the fire forever. And then there's like this eagle sitting in a tree above them, and they're like, what's up, dude? And the eagle's like, hey, these are my oxen, and you guys owe me, otherwise you can't cook this thing. And they're like, okay, well, you can have a part of it. And then he's like, okay, fine. And then it gets cooked, and then he eats the whole damn thing, or all the best parts at least. And then Loki gets mad and starts beating that eagle with a stick. And then the eagle uses magic to make that stick to the eagle. And then he flies high into the air with Loki, and Loki gets shit scared and promises that eagle he'll do anything to get back down. And then the eagle goes, okay, cool. You will have to make sure that I can catch Idun when she comes at some point later on. And then Loki's like, okay, cool, I'm gonna do that. So Loki lures Idun, who carries the magical apples that ensures immortality for the gods. He lures her out of Ausgarður, and then immediately as she's lured out from Ausgarður, Thjatsi comes and snatches her. Okay, now what happens then? The gods are like, holy shit, we're getting old. How are we getting old? Well, we don't have the apples. Where the hell did Elon go? Right? And then through a bunch of complications, they end up finding out that Loki is involved, and they beat his ass. And then they're like, okay, Loki, now you're gonna have to go get it back. And he does that and all that stuff. Okay. All right. There are some serious over and undertones of the story about how Hades kidnaps Persephone in this story. Just throwing that out there. There's some Greek mythology to all of this. It seems to be a very similar story in many ways, at least like in sort of like the very basic fabric of it. Mm-hmm. But aside from that, the gods eventually end up vanquishing Thjazi, burning him in a fire. And then what happens next is that his daughter gets pissed off. And what we see is that his daughter then puts on armor and picks up war gear, and then she goes to war against the Icer. And what Snyder tells us is that the Icer are shitting bricks as soon as she shows up by the wall. So they're like, hey, whoa. Instead of fighting, could we like make a deal? Could we figure something out here?
Okay.
And she's like, okay, yeah, maybe you have to like really compensate me hard for this. They're like, okay, cool. What do you want? She's like, well, I want to marry Balder. So this is really interesting because this is a woman who's dictating terms in marriage, which is very uncommon for Viking Age and medieval Iceland. Viking Age and medieval Iceland is sort of like a situation where women are more or less sold as cattle between families all the time, right? Mm-hmm. So here we have the inverted situation. Then what happens next is that the gods are like, okay, you can perhaps marry Balder, but you have to choose only from the feet. So they put all of these men, all the Icer, all the male Icer, are put behind this curtain, and she can only see their feet.
This is so bonkers. It's insane.
So,
like
she can only see their feet, and she's like, "Oh, this guy has pretty feet. That's got to be Balder." Okay, just think about that for a second.
She doesn't know that Balder's got hooves. He's got hooves.
She's literally going after pretty feet, right? I don't know if there's like some weird connotation to that in medieval and Viking Age Scandinavia, but pretty feet.
I mean, she's assuming Balder's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So he's got pretty feet. But it turns out that the dude with the prettiest feet, apparently among the Icer, is Njörður. Right. So she marries Njörður.
Pedicures.
I guess so.
He's looking after them.
It's all that nice salt water. He's like hanging out by the sea
nice
all the
and
time.
Soft. Yeah, nice and soft and looked after, hydrated.
Yeah. Okay. So what happens next, right, is that Skadi is like, okay, guys, I got a husband. Really not what I was looking for, but I guess whatever. And now you also have to make me laugh because you did a shitty thing. You killed my dad. Right, and
then that's like, all you had to do.
they're like, oh, okay, and that's when Loki then takes a rope, ties it around his testicles, and takes the other side end of the rope and ties it around the beard of a billy goat, and then they run around tucking at each other for a while. And then she laughs.
The fact that that's in a story, that means that must have happened. Somebody at some point in and around the Viking Age, when this story was created, did that. They did that in a hall to make people laugh, and they're like, "That's gonna go in the story." And now they live on forever.
So there is something, if I remember correctly, that suggests that this was actually a relatively common Scandinavian punishment for adultery. If you got caught with someone else's wife as a man, then somebody would tie your balls to a goat and drag you through town.
It's a deterrent. It's a deterrent. It's gonna work.
So yes, so
Okay.
we have that situation, right? And what is, if we like dig into that whole situation, I mean, obviously tying your balls to anything that moves is something that's going to, you know, jeopardize your manhood to some extent. So we may assume that what is actually happening here is that this female deity or whatever she is, Skadi, like literally has the Icer by the balls in the story. There's something
Do we
to
know
that
if
effect here.
she's a goddess, or I
Well,
always thought, was she described as a giant?
Well, that's how she's described in the story. Her father is a giant or a Jötun, right? But in
But also
others,
an eagle.
well, yeah, he's like, that's what they can do, you know, show up as eagles if they want to, like whatever. But so can Odin. I mean, come on, he turns into an eagle all the time. But what we also know though is from other stories that she's referred to as the shining bride of the Icer and as a goddess. So it's like she's many different things. She might, you know, turn into a goddess, I guess, when she is married into the ranks of the gods. That's a possibility. Either way, what stands to reason is that we have here a story that highlights some very, very complicated gender interactions in Old Norse mythology. There's something here that first of all, we have the traditional idea of what constitutes male dominance being challenged, and it fucking crumbles immediately as it's being challenged by this deity, Skadi.
Yeah, as all men do when
Apparently.
challenged. We've all been there.
Touche. So that's the first thing that happens. Like the stories about the Nordic gods in Snorri Sturluson's Edda are generally incredibly male dominated and patriarchal in their structure and how behavior unfolds, all that stuff, right? And then boom, we have this scenario where Skadi shows up and their I guess throbbing penises become pretty flaccid and just like dangly. So that's really what's happening here. They're like, okay, we're sorry.
Okay.
And then, you know, that a physical threat to Loki's testicles.
Okay.
Now, what we also have is another story where we see a similar gender complication, right? And that is the story about Thor, who loses his hammer to Thrym. Thrym steals his hammer, and then he's like, "You can get it back if I can marry Freyja." Not Freyja. Hey, you never know.
They can do what they want.
They can do what they want.
Do what they want. I'm not going to judge.
He's so what happens next is and Thor is like, yes, that's of course what needs to happen. So he just like barges in at Freyja's hall, and he's like, Freyja, go marry this giant over here. And Freyja's like, what the fuck? You can't boss me around. Why would I go to, like, she literally says like, you must think that I'm some crazy whore or something like that. Like that's almost like verbatim what she says. And
okay, so that clearly shows a difference to maybe what actual society is like, because you said obviously earlier that the women tended to be married here, there.
Well, that's what we know
on the
that's what it looks like
in
medieval Iceland, right? That's what it looks like in medieval Iceland, and by extension, the sources that we have on medieval Iceland, by extension, we can suggest that something similar is going on in the Viking Age. But as I pointed out before, Iceland is a very different society from the rest of Scandinavia in the Viking Age. Iceland is actually the anomaly, right? That's something we should always keep in mind whenever we, like, this is a really big problem when we use the literary sources from Iceland to get any sense of what it was like in Norway or Sweden or Denmark or Finland or whatever in northern mainland Europe, because Iceland is an immigrant society where you have a bunch of Norwegians and a bunch of possibly other Scandinavians, and then a bunch of people from the Gaelic communities in Ireland and Scotland who've gone there, and then they're figuring shit out amongst each other, right?
Okay.
And that turns out to be an entirely different society. And any European, somebody in Europe right now in this moment, who goes to America will recognize that this is kind of weirdly similar to stuff that I know, and then it's also just like completely different. And it is my argument that Iceland was probably quite the same to most Scandinavians. Like if you were somebody from the fjords in Norway and you took a trip to Iceland the first time, you'd be like, I recognize a lot of this, but there's also some really, really weird stuff going on that I have no idea what that is, right?
Okay.
So that's probably what we're dealing with when it comes to Iceland in this time period.
Okay.
And so that also means that gender relations could be different in Iceland compared to mainland Scandinavia.
Okay. I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk like specifics about goddesses.
Okay, yeah, but let me just finish this thing about Thor saying like, hey, Freyja, you need to go marry this giant, right? Because what happens next?
Is that because we got a bad review saying that we go off on tangents and don't finish stories?
I don't read the reviews anyway. But no, so I mean, what happens next is, of course, that Thor's manhood is compromised. Immediately after he's said, hey, Freyja, you need to do this, Freyja says, no. And then she's like, you go figure this out yourself. And then what happens next is that Loki and Heimdall is like, hey, let's put some makeup on Thor and dress him up as a chick and then send him off, right? And then Loki's like, I'm on board. Let me, by the way, also dress up as his bridesmaid, and then we go, right? I
feel like Loki just wanted the excuse.
I'm sure he was ready.
He was like, yeah, this is a bit of me.
But the situation is then that we literally have like a god who goes to a goddess and says, you have to do this, and immediately after he said that, like he finds himself in a bridal dress, right? Like you have to ask yourself what's going on, man.
Is that specific? Do they say a bridal dress? Or is it just
no, it's actually a lot more elaborate than that, and I can find it.
And I guess, do we know? I guess that we need to do an episode, I think, on weddings in the Viking Age and what they were like. Because I see this is one of my bugbears, that I see so many people like saying they're having like a hand fasting and a traditional Viking wedding and all this stuff. I would love to know what was real. And I guess, but you saying that, you know, he wore a bridal dress, I guess at least suggests that there was something to it, like this kind of special thing that you wore.
Okay, so listen to this. So right after Freyja has gotten like really pissed off by Thor saying, hey, you have to go marry this giant. Then it goes, all together the Icer came in council, and all the Asunir in consultation, and what they debated, those mighty gods, was how they should get back Hlori's hammer. Hlori is another name for Thor. Then Heimdall said, the wisest of the gods, he knows the future as do the Vanir too. Let's tie on Thor a bridal headdress. Let him wear the great necklace of the breezings. Let keys jingle by his side, and women's clothing fall over his knees, and on his breast display jewels, and we'll put a pointed headdress probably on his head. Then said Thor, the vigorous god, the Icer will call me perverse if I let you tie a bridal headdress on me. Then said Loki, Löve's son, be quiet, Thor, don't speak these words. The giant will be settling in Ausgard, unless you get your hammer back. So there we are. Then it goes on to, then they tied on Thor a bridal headdress and the great necklace of the breezings. They let keys jingle by his side and women's clothing fall down over his knees. And on his breast they displayed jewels and put a pointed headdress properly on his head.
There you go.
There we go. And then said Loki, Löve's son, I'll go with you to be your maid. We two shall drive.
Of course he did. No one even fucking asked him. He was like, I'll come. I'm there. I'm in. All right. Okay. So Thor gets his hammer back. Do you want to?
Eventually, Thor gets his hammer back, and yeah.
I feel like we've spent a lot of time in the episode about goddesses talking about female goddesses that tend to male or that similar sort of situation. So I want to talk about like specific goddesses and see what we know. The first one that you mentioned was Idun. I know we've spoken about it before. Obviously, I guess my first question is from our conversations in the past is, do you think she actually existed, or do you think it was a creation by Snorri to humanize the gods, that these apples kind of could take away their eternal life?
So first things first, apples as a tree fruit of some kind probably did have some relationship to ideas of fertility and such. Any such like fruits of trees are represented on depictions of these matroni I was talking about that appear in the very early period in the Rhineland area.
We have a saying in England, an apple a day keeps the doctor away.
Yes.
So
which is like kind of stupid because like hey, not the case.
Have you eaten an apple every day? Have you tried it?
Okay. Now, okay. So a goddess who carries apples, then and that these apples have some kind of like symbolic power in terms of fertility, everlasting life, or that kind of stuff. That's actually not that far off from a pre-Snorri mythology.
Okay.
That's something to keep in mind. But this little element of like, oh, the gods, they aren't mortal unless they have magic apples, that's where you have to ask yourself, really? You really think that they were so basic that they thought that? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, obviously, any people that worship a bunch of gods believe that these gods are eternal in some way or other, or that it would take a lot for them to lose whatever power they have and so on. So I doubt that is an original element of the mythology.
It seems like a very easy way to, like I said before, to humanize them and kind of explain this Christianity kind of thing. You know, like there's one god and there's these gods, but it's all because of the apples. It's the apples that are doing it. Yeah. They're not really immortal. And
and I think that's what's happening here. Now, Idun as a figure, the etymology of her name is a little bit complicated, disputed, and so on, like so many other things when it comes to that. But her name might mean something to the effect of the Eternal One. So she might be sort of a goddess that represented some either like an eternal cycle of like, you know, life or death and something like that, or eternal life or whatever, something like that. I think if I remember correctly, the first part of her name is associated with the word that Scandinavians use for evergreens. Some Scandinavians might know it in the version Idegran, which is, you know, evergreen fir fir tree of
Okay.
some kind.
So
So
just
there's
does
something to that.
does her name predate Snorri?
Yeah.
Like her. So okay, so maybe there is something to it then. If that
Yeah.
if her name links to this kind of evergreen and kind of eternal life.
Yeah, I think so. And so yeah, there's something to that. So she might have been an original goddess who was associated with things like fertility and green lustrous growth and that kind of stuff. That's a possibility. Okay,
Which
some of them, and I'm sure like most people who started like listening to this episode being like, oh, I want to hear about the goddesses, they're like, why the hell have they not talked about Frigg yet?
we're getting there. Patience. Patience. That's my next question.
Okay, good. We have Frigg and we also have Freyja as two deities who seem to mirror each other a little bit and then also very much be very different deities. Sadly, there's not a lot about these two goddesses in the mythology, right? We see Frigg mainly being active in the story about Baldur's death in Snorri Sturluson's Edda, and then we also see her in the prelude to Grimni's Maul, Grimni's sayings in the Eddic poem Grimni's sayings, and also Vafthrûdnir's sayings, so Vafthrûdnir's Maul. That's where she's mostly active. Then in Lokasenna, Loki's quarrel with the gods, we also see her cribbing a little bit, and then she's done. And the same with Freyja. She shows up here and there as sort of like a side character. So there's not a lot of like descriptions of these deities, and this has something to do with the fact that this literature is like male focused. It's mostly interested in male gods, right? Digging into the etymology of Frigg and Freyja, Frigg seems to connote something like beloved or something like that. And Freyja, we're told by Snorri Sturluson in it might actually not be Snorri Sturluson, but in the beginning of the Norwegian Kings sagas, that from her name comes the word for a married woman or married women, fruvr, which are still used in Scandinavian languages today, like in the Danish frue. So that seems to be sort of like the basis for their names. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean then that these two deities, they sort of like are the symbolic housewives of the gods? That might be the case. If we look at the mythology around Frigg, we also know that she lives in a place called Fensalir, which literally means marsh halls, right? So then we circle back to all of the stuff that I've been talking about with like lakes and bogs and marshes, right? Yeah, this goddess lives in the marshes, and that might have been her original role as that goddess that you sacrifice things to in the marshes and in the bogs. But in the story, in the stories that we have, she is mostly a concerned mother and concerned housewife. She's a concerned housewife in Vafthrûdnir's Maul, where Odin is like, I am going to go test my wisdom with this giant over here, la la la. And then she's like, you sure about that? Don't you like just want to hang out at home and drink a cup of coffee instead of like going out and doing stupid nonsense? And Odin's like, shut up, I shall leave and I will win this battle. And then he goes out there, right? In the story about Baldur's death, she tries to secure Baldur's life, right? We know Baldur has these dreams about how he's going to die. Then Frigg goes out and is like, hey, everything in the entire world must swear that you are not going to kill him. And then she forgets about the mistletoe, and then the mistletoe kills him. Spoiler alert. right? And then she
We're known for them now after
I
the
think so.
episode, Josh.
And then she fails to secure that he lives forever, the poor guy. And then once he has died and Hermodr, he strikes a deal with Hel, saying, hey, how can we get Baldur back? Hel is like, well, make everything in the world cry for him. And then the gods are like, okay, cool. And then Freyja is, of course, part of that whole thing too. And what happens is that everything in the world cries except one, somebody named Thuk, which is sort of like an ironically translates to thank you.
Okay.
Or something like that. Maybe it does. And it might have been Loki in disguise. That's at least kind of what Snuddy is saying. I
think that's probably what most people have heard.
Yeah,
well, that's at least the story that I heard, is that Loki goes in disguise and refuses to cry, and obviously he fucks up the whole thing of bringing Baldur back to life.
Yeah. So yeah, that's her mythological role, is to be that concerned mother, concerned housewife, so to speak. And Freyja is even more elusive, actually. She shows up a little bit here and there, but she's mostly a side character. And
so
we know that she's associated with sexual activity, right? That is something that we know from different hints that we get in the mythology, and also historical sources of various kinds. So that means, of course, that scholars have suggested that she's sort of like a Venus type of goddess. But
so
really hard to say what her
if
role
she's
really
more
was.
If she's more of a side character, how come she's become like the prominent female kind of goddess amongst all of this, whether it's like the modern community? Freyja is by far the most known, the one that people relate to. She's the most well known. So why do you think that is, that if she's kind of traditionally a side character, but
So the way that this goes is this: you have a scholar sitting somewhere, usually in the 19th century. This scholar has read Old Norse mythology. He's read all the different texts that are there. And then he takes all of the mentions of Freyja in all of these texts, and then he puts together a nice little coherent picture of her in his let's call it his Deutsche Mythologie, because his name is Jakob Grimm. So that would translate to Teutonic mythology in modern English, or English translations at least. And then he adds a bunch of stuff that he knows from folklore and from mythologies that he believes are reasonably associated with Nordic mythology. So that could be, for instance, Greek, Roman, Celtic, Slavic, Persian, Vedic from India, and so on, under this pretext of the Indo-European community that all of these stories in his little mind belong to. You see? And so that's how you get like this elaborate picture of a deity. Some of it comes from the Nordic material, some of it comes from analysis of other sources, and then some of it comes from a combination of folklore and other things, presenting a more or less acceptable argument depending on which scholar we're dealing with. Now, Jacob Grimm, for instance, he did a decent job in many ways, but there are also some cases where you're like, you know what, dude, that's a little much, right? And that's what you see with most scholarship, right? Later on, some 100 years later, we will be looking at this, and And then we'd be going, okay, he had a good point over here, but this part right here doesn't work out that much. But of course, popular ideas about the Nordic gods and mythology in general doesn't develop as quickly, right, as scholarship. So, and popular ideas about these gods and goddesses and all that stuff, they don't sift out those aspects that have been debunked by later scholars, right? So you can see it in this way, like as we scholars are writing our dictionaries on Nordic mythology, right? You will have a scholar who says one thing about Freyja back in the 19th century, right? And then that thing that he says gets reproduced into, say, the 1920s or 30s or 50s even, maybe 60s. And then somebody is like, hey, wait a minute, is that even true? Let me just like look at that. And then they do a bunch of research on it. And then scholars like, hey, wait a minute, actually what this guy was saying about this goddess, Freyja, for instance, it isn't quite true. That's not really what the texts are saying. This is based on an assumption that he made by conferring with the Greek mythology on Venus or something like that. And then they ditched that bit. And then subsequently other other dictionaries on mythology will not include that little bit, right? But that doesn't mean that that little bit goes out of the memory of the public, right? Because the public memory, right, is cultural memory. That's essentially everything that is available, and people will choose to believe whatever they will choose to believe. Their filter is not scholarship, right? It's how do I personally relate to things.
It's fucking memes nowadays.
It is. That's fucking what it is. Memes nowadays.
Like I swear, honestly, I'm 100% sure that most people get their information on all of this from memes, and they are horrendous. You see the same ones pop up time and time again. Yeah, it's insane, but that's kind of the way it is now. That everybody just gets their information from the meme.
There's a lot of that out there,
unless they listen to the Nordic Mythology podcast.
Unless they listen to the Nordic Mythology podcast. Yes.
So, okay, I think the big question that most people have when it comes to goddesses is, do you think that Frigg and Freyja are the same person?
No, I don't.
Because that's one thing I see kind of pop up time and time again. The same question, that question.
Yeah, I don't. I think so. There's one thing we haven't touched on, and that is place names.
Okay.
So place names in the Scandinavian area suggest very few goddesses. There's a lot of deities, male deities out there, right? You have Odin, Thor, Freyr. You can find Ullr, right? Who's hardly even mentioned in the written mythology, but he's got a bunch of place names in Norway and Sweden, 0 in Denmark. Iceland doesn't have any gods or goddesses in any of their place names, just FYI, which is really fucking interesting. When you go back to what I was saying before about this being, the anomaly in the Viking Age, right? Like this is like a region that is settled by Scandinavians that presumably when they start going there, right, they have like these little areas where they have gods and clustering in place names. Like you have a Freyr, Odin, Thor, Njordr, and so on, right there in a little cluster around a little temple site or whatever, and they go there and worship, and then they decide to up and leave from Norway primarily and go to Iceland, and then they don't build similar little structures with like place names dedicated to Freyr and Odin and Thor in Iceland for some reason. It's completely blank. All they have is Hov, right, which means temple site. So you the gods don't know what's going on there, by the way. It's like really, really, really interesting to consider. Anyway, going back to this Scandinavian landscape with place name, right? You have these gods there, and then you have Tyr in the Danish area, except for like one island off the coast of Norway. Tyr has a bunch of place names in the Danish area. Some of those place names probably actually don't even refer to him as a god, but it's just like the word Tyr, as it means also God or something worshipped. So that's another complication here. But we don't find many goddesses in these place names. There are a handful that you could perhaps suggest are references to Freyja and Frigg, and maybe Njörður as a female version of Njörður in the version Njörður. So like we have maybe like 3 female deities and then a bunch of male deities in the Scandinavian place names, which is just also interesting. The situation is probably.
Do you think? Go on. If you're
the last little bit is the situation is probably that these place names actually most of them are from after the 500s, so they come with that pivot towards male religious activity and temple sites, because it is from the 500s and onwards that you get the temple sites. Before that, you don't really have temple sites in the same way, at least. So something happens that like reconfigures the religious landscape of Scandinavia in the 500s, where you start like worshiping in male deities in building structures of some kind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's probably why those sites out there are named after male gods, because they seem to be from the 500s and onwards mostly. All right, on to your question.
I think you just answered it.
Okay.
That's what I was wondering. I was wondering what we could take from the fact that there's so many male place names and so little goddess ones. I was wondering yeah.
So and you know, that also begs the question, like, are we supposed to find gods in the landscape like that? And do we do that in other cultures? Now, some cultures do, other cultures don't. There's a lot to be said about like that whole idea, but we can see that they are present in the Scandinavian cultures. Like the gods are emplaced in the landscape. They have holy sites, so to speak. But we don't know much about what that holy site actually meant to those people who called it that initially, right? Like a place that's called Thor's arable fields, which would in Sweden be Torsåker, right? Right. Like we don't know what that means, except that some person in Sweden was like, hey, let me call my fields or name my fields after the god Thor. Okay. That doesn't mean that that's like synonymous with worship, right? You don't have to assume that. So that's an entirely different discussion. Going back to goddesses in the mythology that I mentioned, right? Snorri has this whole list. He's got a list of Ausinir in what is it? In chapter 35 of Gylfaginning. Right. He's like, who are the Ausinir? And then High goes, the highest is Frigg. And then the second one is Saga. The third one is Air. The fourth one is Givjon, and Fulla, and Freyja, and blah, 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 blah. And some of these goddesses do seem to have names that are really old. Givjon, her name we can find in the early Germanic form, carved in those little altars for the Matrona as Gabia. So that's a really old name for a goddess that is very elusive, because Givjon really only shows up as a goddess who tricks a Swedish king into letting her take a piece of land, and the land that she takes becomes the island of Zealand in the Danish archipelago. So like that's really all she does, and then she's like mentioned like in passing here and there. And then we have a bunch of like goddesses that Snorri mentioned, whose names seem to just be derived from words in Old Norse. Like he goes, Lofn. She is so kind and good to pray to that she gets leave from Allfather or Frigg for people's union between women and men, even if before it was forbidden or refused. Okay, so I guess that's adultery or something like that. Hence, it is from her name that it is called Lof, permission. As well as when something is praised, Lovat, greatly by people. Okay. Ninth, Vaur. She listens to people's oaths and private agreements that women and men make between each other. Thus, these contracts are called Varar, right? So these are all like references to words that exist in his language at the time, and he says that these words are come from goddesses, right? Now,
do you think they actually have, or do you think he's?
Well, this is really fascinating because scholars have generally in like Old Norse mythology agreed that, oh, this is just stuff that Snorri is coming up with, that these didn't exist as goddesses. But these scholars don't seem to be particularly familiar with Greek mythology, where you have the same thing in the theogony, you know, where we're told that, oh, all of these different gods, they're in charge of these particular concepts, and that's why we have a word that goes like this and a word that goes like that and so on. So like this is not impossible that these goddesses could actually have been sort of like generated from words in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit like give and take, like you don't really know, but obviously we don't have any more details on them than this little bit that Snorri gives us right here in his sort of like brief rundown.
Okay.
So that's how that works out, unfortunately. It would be quite interesting to see what that actually looked like in that Viking Age landscape, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And the last bit about goddesses is, of course, all the Valkyrie and Nornir and whatever else they're called that we don't normally include in this like idea of high gods or goddesses or whatever we want to call that, because they have definitely been perceived in the same way as goddesses, I'm sure, by people. Like if you can have a runic inscription from Bergen in 1380 that mentions of Valkyrie, right, and a bunch of other mythological beings, it means that was a significant mythological figure to people in Scandinavia for that time period. That's got to be what is happening here. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, are a lot of these Valkyries that we talk about and we see mentioned in the sources, are they in fact goddesses? Because they could be, right? Mm-hmm. The same with the Norns. Are they in fact goddesses? Is it what about the Disir? Are they in fact goddesses? And I say yes, they are. That's what they are. They have similar roles as goddesses. So it's like putting all of this stuff in like this hierarchy when they have like the Icer and the Vanya and then the Alva and whatever and blah blah blah, and Valkyrie is somewhere over in the corner serving beer for Odin. That's nonsense. That's not how people have been thinking about it. These Valkyries were definitely goddesses to people in the Viking Age, I'm sure.
That kind of circles back to how we started on what is a goddess. Because I think your pardon?
I planned this.
Oh, there we go. I think everybody probably has like a different definition of what they assume a goddess is. I mean, if I saw a Valkyrie come and pick somebody up from the battlefield or whatever, I would be like, that's a fucking god. That's a god.
Right? Right?
Like
Right?
that's not. I don't see that every day. That is a god.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would not question
I wouldn't
the
be like,
godliness of that
yeah, I wouldn't be
figure
like,
right there.
maybe let me just check. Have you got an ID card? Can I see if you're a god? I'd be like, yeah, you are. Okay. Before we wrap up, I think it is there any particular goddess that stands out for you that maybe like people don't know, like an unsung hero or something like that? Maybe like one that's just kind of exists but is in the background that the average person wouldn't know of or have heard of.
I mean, there are a lot. I think I've mentioned this before, but I've like compiled a list of all deities and like mythological beings in the entire Nordic region that have, well, I guess like the common aspect is that the name is Germanic in origin or were worshipped by Germanic peoples or mentioned in sources that are attached to Germanic speaking peoples' mythology. So that's Old Norse mythology, that's old High German literature, that is archaeological evidence from the year 0 and onwards, or even before the year 0. And we end up with about 800 something deities at large in that whole cultural region.
Okay.
And about 300 of them can be classified as female, right? So you have 500 male approximately. These are rough numbers, and 300 females, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that means that there are actually a lot of goddesses that I think people should be aware of if they're interested in all of this stuff. But like if we just go to the Old Norse material, I would say that people should look more into Saga, like who lives in Sökvabek. She's mentioned in Grimnia's sayings, and she's also mentioned briefly in chapter 35 of Gylfaginning that I was reading from before. Like this goddess that drinks from golden cups with Odin every night. I mean, who the hell is she, man?
Yeah.
Like, it's just this like brief reference to that. Apparently, she hangs out with Odin every night, drinking from golden cups in a place called Sökvabek, which means something.
That's
like
a euphemism. That's a euphemism if I ever heard one.
It is, I think it is,
isn't it?
Yeah. so like, yeah, I think people should look more into what she is, right? She's one of those other marsh dwelling or lake dwelling goddesses that seems to be a theme. That is very much a theme, right? You also have the Norns that come from the well or the lake that stands under the tree of Yggdrasil, or they come to it, or whatever. It's a little unclear in the wording. There's a lot with like goddesses and water bodies in general. And that, of course, then reminds me that we haven't touched on Ron's daughters, but there's a bunch of
that could be an episode on its own.
Yeah, exactly. That could be an episode on its own. But there's a bunch of daughters of Ron that are associated with water as well. Boom. There you go.
I've got a Eurovision party to get to. Eurovision.
That is right, man. I am not going to keep you from your Eurovision party, even though that I would never be caught dead in a scenario like that.
Stop trying to be cool for the podcast.
I am sorry, but it has nothing to do with being cool. I would rather, I don't know, remove my own brain through my ear canal with an ice pick than listening to the music that is being played at Eurovision.
No, it's fabulous. It's fabulous. All right, let's get out of here. So no, firstly, it obviously you were back last week after a little break. We've been kind of all over the place lately. I know we're recording this on a Saturday, not Tuesday, because life happened again. Once again, I know Jonas had to move things, but hopefully from now on out, we're going to be back to our usual slots. We're going to get things back running smooth. Obviously, we appreciate everyone who's stuck with us. I know I said this on the on the episode with Josh when Mathias wasn't here. We're going to try and get back to that kind of smooth running of things. We just have all sorts of ups and downs going on in both our lives, I think, recently. But yeah, we're gonna get back there. I think we're back there, hopefully.
I think so too. We're back, and we will be back at our normal scheduled slots in the future. Yes,
exactly. If you want to watch the show live, if you support us on Patreon, you get to do that. I mean, the chat in the chat that goes on whilst we do the episode is fucking insane. It's so distracting, but it's also so hard not to look at it. It's so much fun. So if you do want to join in on that, just support us on Patreon. It's the price of giving me or Mathias a coffee once a month, literally one of us. And you get access to the live show. It's Nordic Mythology Podcast Patreon/Nordic Mythology Podcast. It's really easy to set up. It doesn't take much time. It takes a couple of minutes. It really helps us out, keeps us growing the show, helps us, keep Shan in a job. It means a lot to us. If you can't do that, just share the podcast, let people know about it, tell your friends, share it on your Instagram.
Great
leave
reviews.
us a 5-star rating. Yes. Let's get rid of that one of the person who said we start a topic and don't finish it. So let's get rid of that. We appreciate anything you can do. If we understand that not everybody can support financially, so even like I say, just sharing, rating, letting people know about it helps us kind of spread, and then we can keep growing and onwards and upwards. We've got some big plans this year.
Very big plans.
Very big plans.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for your awesome comments in the chat as well.
That chat has been distracting today.
It has.
It has been distracting. I mean, people should sign up just to join in the chat because it has been fucking wild. So, all right. Thank you for listening. See you next time.